Okay, folks, welcome back to another long form episode of the Elemental Philosophorum with our good friend Mark from Alt Media United. Brother, how are you today?
Doing great. Glad to be here for another round table into the periodic table of elements.
That was
Awesome,
fun. That was fun.
100%. Well, today's topic, we're going to be covering iron. I don't know if any of you guys wanted to start it off. If not, there's a few things that I found peculiar to kick it off as well, but up to you guys.
Well, I'll just give people a breakdown for kind of like the general stuff. I mean, iron is incredibly important to the history of mankind on a technological standpoint, but I think people would be surprised to know that human beings or have been using iron way before they were able to kind of smelt it from ores. Um, so that was why I chose like iron, because I'm like, all right, there's some history to iron. It's more than just like one of these newer elements that I'm sure we'll get into in the future episodes here. But it's the atomic number 26. The symbol is Fe. That comes from the Latin ferrum, which is probably, a derivation of some word from another word from another word, because iron
Right.
has, like I said, existed in our culture for a long time. So it has a pretty interesting history. But with that being said, it's the most common element on Earth, right in front of oxygen. So that's kind of the primary reason why, when I was kind of thinking about what we would talk about, I was like, iron sounds like, it not only does it hold such an interesting place in human culture, but it's the most common element on the planet. So
Wow. Well, that's quite significant because I mean, I just wanted to say that citing nationalgeographic.org, something I found quite peculiar is, and I just to give the full context here, and I quote, magnetism is the force exerted by magnets when they attract or repel each other, of course. It's caused by the motion of electric charges. Now, interestingly enough, if we take a look here, in most substances, equal numbers of electrons spin in opposite directions, which cancels out their magnetism. That is why materials such as cloth or paper are said to be weakly magnetic. In substances such as iron, cobalt, and nickel, most of the electrons spin in the same direction. This makes the atoms in these substances strongly magnetic, but they are not yet magnets. End quote. Now, the interesting thing I find about this, particularly having to do with the electronics or the spins of the electrons in general, has to do essentially with what many people would, I guess you could say, relate to, again, the same concept of, if I'm not mistaken, Sir Roger Penrose pertaining to the spinor theory. I'm not trying to get too
Okay.
into physics and all that because again, I'm not a physicist, but I found some interesting correlations pertaining to the way in which there's a description pertaining to the electromagnetic charge of certain elements of Mr. Penrose's spinor theory and what we see here pertaining to the subatomic structures and all that and the electrical charges within iron.
The, I mean, this is an element that has not only been around on the Earth for like 5,000 years or so. We've been trying to use it, like Mark said, before even smelting it. But I mean, it comes from space too. I found specifically an Intuit colony, I guess, or settlement that literally settled next to a meteor and would use its iron for generations and generations for just any use it could find.
Inuit, like up in northern
Inuit,
Canada.
Inuit.
Inuit, yeah, from
Yes,
Canada, right?
yes. So I
Awesome.
mean,
Yeah.
they literally, this doesn't just come out of the natural processes of the Earth. It's all over the galaxy, universe, whatever.
Well, something that a guy I've interviewed talked about is like, I don't know if this is related, but his theory, of the electric universe was that this
Right.
Exactly.
iron forms, in our atmosphere somehow due to like whatever solar storm or planetary storm that's going on. So like the way I visualized it at first, and I don't know how true this is, it might be true considering this picture I just found, but like imagine like a lightning bolt shaped meteor of iron just like hitting the earth and
Yes.
like creating like a tower almost. And then, there's this really ancient iron pillar in Delhi where it's like, you know, kind of looks like it just like is in the ground and they built around it. You know, you could maybe see like how they found that iron and then propped it up there, but like how much cooler of a myth is it that like, or to think that this iron just hit the ground like a tower and then they came along and carved it into the shape of what it is now. I mean, that's just really cool. And yeah, it's interesting because meteoric iron is like the proper term for it, and they have artifacts of meteoric iron in King Tut's tomb. And at that time, it was thought to be like a weapon from the gods, like a heavenly divine weapon. If you had a weapon made of iron, it was literally thought of like, oh, this came from the gods. And
Right.
that's why the god of war, Mars, was associated with iron. And so you can see a lot of connections there, especially considering what iron's become, you know, going more recent times. It's incredibly useful for weaponry. So, you know, this is like, you know, huge to consider.
These meteors, right? You talk about this, you know, lightning strike shaped meteor. Well, there's a couple like very notable meteors all over the earth. The probably the most interesting one I found that just builds so many questions. It's called, let me make sure I say it right. Yeah, Hoba in Nambia, and it is an 80,000-year-old meteor that left no crater. There is no crater where this meteor just is. It weighs 66 tons of like 88% iron, 82% iron, and it left no crater. I mean, 80,000 years old, left no crater. You immediately build into, okay, how did it get there? 80,000 years ago, were things, people, whatever, moving it to this spot? What, I mean, why is this geographically important for it to be moved here? This iron element seems to do a lot with, ley lines, genetic, like geometrical connections of the earth. This is a very important space on that same, you know, ley lines of like the pyramids and all that stuff over in Africa. It's just a weird thing to have been put somewhere.
Well, it's definitely, you know, brings to mind like this idea of Mother Earth. It's like magnetic, you know, this iron comes from space, and like almost like sperm hitting an egg, this
Right.
like iron fertilizes the earth with a new, you know, element that humans can then utilize to evolve into a, you know, a greater civilization from a technological aspect, you know.
Absolutely,
building
yeah.
architecture. And like you see it in 5th century China, they were making cast iron, you know, before anyone else, and that was really pivotal to them becoming, you know, one of the oldest empires, continuous, you know, nations to this day. You know, the Chinese country, you know, is more than just a country. It's existed longer continuously than any other nation, you know, albeit that they're communists now. That's a pretty big, you know, dip from what they used to be. But, you know, considering how new the United States is, the country I live in, and even Canada too is very young. So it's like, yeah, this is an ancient culture that's used iron clearly to their advantage.
Well, if I could jump in actually, sorry, Camden, go ahead, finish your
Well, no,
thought, and
yeah,
then
to their advantage, right? There's lots of benefits even in modern science to the way we're using iron now. I mean, this is you go back to how were they using it, like I talked about that Hoba meteor today. And there's a Scandinavia, where my notes here, Scandinavia, there's electrified railways that use iron ore to then perpetually generate more energy so that it literally powers itself. I mean, this is an incredibly reactive, useful, and productive element. And you just have to, I mean, how far back does using iron for productive means go?
Well, interestingly enough, I did want to bring something up here according to sciencedirect.com. Now, again, as to the veracity behind this in terms of the surface level of academia, I don't think you can get any more um, uh, I guess, official than this per se. This is from the Journal of the Franklin Institute. We see here, and I quote, not many years ago, it was quite generally believed that iron was unable to follow rapid magnetic changes. Experiments which showed an apparent decrease in the permeability of the iron with an increase in the frequency of the magnetic cycle furnished a basis for a theory that iron was magnetically sluggish. Further and more accurate experiments proved, however, that the effects which had been previously ascribed to a peculiarity of the material were in reality caused by eddy currents in the sample. Furthermore, it was found that due to eddy currents, eddy spelt EDDY, eddy currents, and the magnetic properties of iron, the magnetization in high frequency fields was confined to a thin surface layer of the piece. This, quote, magnetic skin effect reduced the cross section of the iron, which was magnetically active, even though the laminations were extremely thin, end quote. Something that I would like to relate to that is I was told off the record by a certain individual who had a lunch with Mr. Lou Elizondo was that again, think of him as you will, or whatever you prefer. But Mr. Elizondo was allegedly, doing sketches, drawing papers pertaining to a particular craft called that many know to be the Tic Tac craft. And interestingly enough, I believe I'm allowed to say this. Yeah, I think I'm pretty 99% sure I am. The skin of the Tic Tac craft, according to Mr. Elizondo, to my friend there, Mr. Elizondo found quite peculiar the way in which the very thin outer layer of the craft, not the energetic layer, but the actual material layer of the Tic Tacs, not any other craft, specifically the Tic Tacs, responded in a very peculiar way. And I can't help but think, I'm not saying that iron has to do with that, but if that same concept were to be applied to the craft or to certain aspects of this Tic Tac craft, again, we don't know if this craft was, physically, I guess you could say poignant or strong, or we don't know if this was an interdimensional craft, but I find that thin layer concept to be very interesting because we're seeing that now with things like graphene. I know we have to be careful about what we can and can't say about
Interesting
graphene,
about
but
what you just said, though. I'm looking at some of the things I put together for iron, and sparing a whole lesson on metallurgy. An alloy is a mixture of metals, right? You heat up
Right.
the elements to create a different version, an alloy, right? So iron becomes steel when we melt it with, some percentage of carbon, right? So there's a process of taking iron and making it into steel. Now that steel has different properties, and one of the properties, or one of the three forms of iron that you can create from an alloy, like what it's limited to. One of them is called epsilon iron, right? And epsilon iron is known for being anti-ferromagnetic. So it it reacts magnetically in a different way than the other forms of alloys. Now, I'm kind of beating around the bush here because I really, I'm in deep water and I don't know how to swim when it comes to this kind of science, but that to me is curious. It's like, well, if there is some kind of magnetic property to iron and then they can alter it somehow, maybe that fits into what they're utilizing to create these crafts that we see and been known as the Tic Tac whatever.
Right. I mean,
right.
there's certain. I mean, iron most commonly will turn to rust, right? Iron oxide is obviously something that commonly happens with iron exposed to the atmosphere. But there's several times in history that we see that for whatever reason, well, I guess I'm about to tell the reasons, but rust doesn't happen. Our best example of that, go back to my notes, the Iron Pillar of Delhi, constructed in the year 375 to 415 CE by Chandragupta II. It doesn't rust. That is an old. I mean, I guess at this point, almost over 1,000 years old, almost iron pillar that just hasn't rusted at all. The chemical makeup of it is pointed to the what they've found through, you know, obvious study of it, is that it uses a crystalline iron hydrogen phosphate form. So it's mostly iron, back to that alloy thing, but all the way back in the year 375, were they already doing these complex alloy combinations of elements and to make better iron, make less corrosive, less wear and tear from the elements iron. So if we then expand that to these tic tac vehicles, these otherworldly things, their science is probably even better, right? So they can make, you know, alloys even more impervious to the effects of not only the atmosphere, but let's even take it to impervious to the effects of space and time, you know?
Right. Exactly.
Wow.
Well, one thing too that I found quite peculiar is I wonder if, generally speaking, if iron would be a substance that would be, sorry, not a substance, a material that would be something that could be used within certain craft or within certain
Right.
interdimensional apparatuses, if you want to call it, for solidifying or materializing a certain type of object within a certain dimension. And what I mean by that is when you have, for example, one craft allegedly going into another dimension or another reality, or even, I guess you could say, teleporting, for a matter of fact, if there is something in which resides with externally that the occupants of the craft internally cannot feel any of the G-force while teleporting, transporting, you name it. If there is something that materializes via iron that allows it to sort of come to a halt relative to, you know, the location that these occupants are trying to go to, if that makes sense. Sort of like, if we take, for example, this piece of paper, a lot of people know that I've done this before, representative of time. And again, instead of going straight somewhere, like from, you know, point A to point B, you are then folding or bending it to come to you, irrespective of everyone else around you. However, the place where iron comes in my opinion, would be, is it possible that some type of electromagnetic charge relative to a certain iron or variant or altered variant of iron in or around the craft would help that sort of, I guess you could say, come to a halt in a, say,
Yeah.
materialistic dimension compared to that of a more esoterically oriented one, if that makes sense.
Right. No, I'm with you. I'm with you. And it seems to only point to um how iron even interacts with sentient organic life forms, because right, we've talked about it in these inanimate tic tac pillars, meteors, but iron seems to do a lot to us, you know, like obviously we all know, like we have a large amount of iron in our body. You can be iron deficient, you can like, but there's like, what's the deal with it? Because one of the most interesting stories I found of iron in a person, they were building the Transcontinental Railroad, US, right? This railroad foreman was slapped through the head with a iron rod. It literally landed 80 feet away from him, it says right here, and went all the way through his head. He did not die. He was speaking again minutes later. He literally only died 12 years later. So I mean, you think of you know, getting shot through even a bullet, not a railroad tie, going through your head, gonna kill you.
Right.
But a pure iron rod through the brain did not kill this man. That, I mean, like, so what about the interactivity of the organic matter of life and iron kind of produce a homeostasis, I guess is the best way to say it. Like, right, like it doesn't
Right.
ruin or disrupt the body. It only melds with, passes through. And you know, it's strange how iron acts coexistingly in inanimate objects and in the body.
Right. Did you want to jump in, Mark, or?
Absolutely, because you know, I was hoping to take this conversation in that direction, and I did not
Good.
expect it to go, you know, that extreme, man. Wow, I never heard that before. I've heard like weird stories about people surviving like railroad accidents like that
Yeah.
from that time period, but never like that particular story. And I wanted to, bring that whole topic up because, like, we're talking about magnetism, possibly the ability to alter the states of iron, right? So
Right.
that's the prerequisite to what I'm about to say, which is like, all right, Camden, you said it perfectly. There's iron in our body, it's in our blood. But now when we consider like, right, what people say about the moon. Now, I don't know how much iron is in the moon, but if it's as abundant as it is on Earth, I'm sure
Yeah.
it's in the moon, right? So, there's magnetic properties to the moon. We see that with the tides. We see that with our bodies, right? Human beings, particularly women, before the days of the Gregorian calendar, were all synced up to the moon.
Yep.
And that's a lot to do with blood and the whole process of menstruation, but it's also because there's iron in our blood. And as men, we're not different from from women all that much, in the sense that we too have iron in our blood. And in ancient times, that was seen as fiery water, right? That was this sort of metaphysical term for iron. And when you consider what we do with iron, we heat it up and melt it, and it becomes liquid, and then it forms back again into the mold that you pour it into. And they had like legendary weapons, like I said, that were created from meteoric iron or Damascus steel, and like
Yeah.
these special types of like metals that they were able to alchemize. But on the metaphysical, human alchemical level, this iron it's literally liquid fire. Like, your blood heats up. You've heard the phrase, my blood was boiling. Like, people have had fevers experience that same feeling of like hot blood, right? So there's clearly not just an electricity aspect to this with the heating up, but there's that magnetic aspect as well. And then you consider
Exactly,
what
yeah.
they're doing with we'll call it the jab and the graphene, and maybe that being just permeated through our environment. Like, what if graphene is inherent to iron, so now it's going to bond somehow with this iron and then alter that on a really alchemical chemical periodic level, right? I mean, this is the elemental level that we're trying to reach with this show. But yeah, it's just, it's no coincidence that they call this, they relate it to chakma, which is the life force or wisdom. And it's, all goes back to this kind of Kabbalah type stuff. But within those lessons, they talk about iron as fiery water.
Right.
It's interesting.
yeah.
I immediately, while you were talking about it on the moon, I went and looked up, and the first thing that I, got into, they have found, back to your magnetism, they have found a lot of iron and titanium on the northern hemisphere of the moon. It is not in large enough traces for them to know if there's not a lot of it in the southern hemisphere. So we're not talking about like the light side of the moon versus the dark side of the moon. We're north and south of it, which I again obviously point toward, poles of magnets, right? So that's interesting that it really, yes, it absolutely is on the moon, but so far only found in the northern hemisphere.
Well, interestingly enough, again, referencing back to sciencedirect.com, I just wanted to quickly bring this, throw this in here while I can. The magnetic skin effect, again, reduced, and I quote, the cross section of the iron, which was magnetically active even though the laminations were extremely thin. However, now, I didn't read this part yet. Careful experimental measurements compared with theoretical calculations proved that the real permeability of iron remained unchanged at frequencies up to about 10 to the sixth, and that previous results had been in serious error due to neglect of the factors mentioned. This fact having been established, efforts were made to see what practical use could be made of iron in high frequency work, and to that end, some extensive experimental investigations of the saturation curves and core losses were made upon specimens laminated as thinly as was commercially practicable. The resulting data have furnished a basis for design, end quote. Now, the reason I say that is because I can't help but think of, again, what you said, Mark, about iron being in our blood, iron being in our body, regardless of gender or anything like that.
Right.
If there would be something, and again, I'm not trying to connect this to what's going on in the world right now, or the boop boop, we'll call it.
Well, but I will make mention. Sorry, I think we might
Sure.
have found our next element to do. A graphite of sorts. But anyway,
Right, exactly. And I can't help but think that if they're, again, showing that this study, this is from 1917, if I'm not mistaken, this journal here, to know what they know at this level, if there would be some type of magnetic response to iron if placed in a certain frequency. Therefore, if the human body were to be in an environment geographically and physically where there would be some type of manifestation of, abnormal frequencies that cannot be detected, again, with our normal senses. But if there was something that could alter that within our blood, I cannot help but think what that could do. Not just make people feel tired or feel like they're going to faint, when someone says I'm low on iron or something like this. I'm speaking of something far more, maybe very positive, but also something far more depraved as well.
yeah.
Well, considering, back to the alchemical side of things, esoteric alchemy, we're talking about metal iron as mercury in the body, right? So mercury is part of this alchemical process, and it definitely, is associated to reproduction and sex, right? So,
Right.
and I'm not an adept, so I'm not going to go into all of like the ins and outs of it, but from what I'm reading here on a publicly available site, it says the life force, meaning mercury, burns tissue cells in physical bodies as a flaming wick dissolves its candle wax. Both the body and the candle are sure to burn in its due course, making the transition of physical death a certainty. Tempering the course of this life force towards mercury through art sustains the physical vehicle to its natural span of between 120 and 144 years on average. The multiplying virtue. So this is maybe the wrong thing to read, but I'll that was really interesting. So I'll kind of expand on it. So they're talking about how iron, it's expanding on your creative energies and your ability to basically, and their term is art, but I think in the modern world we would consider art as like something you do with passion that
But
doesn't
that's what I was about to say. Like, this is art. We're doing art right now, right?
Well, but as it doesn't pertain to like your direct Maslow's hierarchy of needs, like you're getting your food, water, and shelter, those kind of things are taken care of, then you can pursue art, whatever that is. And it's not just podcasting, but great point. That's kind of like our art here. And I love that you pointed that out. But this whole article that I'm reading, it's on jamesinvestigates.com. So people can check that out. Iron Alchemical. But he's talking about, the sort of search for the philosopher's stone or the immortal, the immortality thing. And they're talking about people living till like 144 years old, which is interesting. Like, that with what we just alluded to with graphene, like, and its connections to this possible Depop campaign to thin the herd, so to speak. It's like, all right, so they're using this kind of aspect that's already tied to, longevity and reproduction. It just fits right in. We don't need to get into all the details on the boo-boo, as Dave called it.
Right.
I think that's like kind of what we're talking about here, because when you consider what's going on a planetary scale, it's dark arts occult, like Sam Tripoli says, and he says it that way. And I think he's right. And he doesn't even know how right he is sometimes, like in detail, like down to the core. There are groups who understand alchemy to the point where they are utilizing it on all fronts. And it fits into the industries that we see iron being used in, and all of the different innovations and players in the long history of man's use of iron.
If I could jump in very quickly, when you said alchemy and all that, it made me think of the Vril Society pertaining to, again, the Nazis and all that. Not to say that that was exclusive to them, but that's what the Vril Society is generally most known for. It made me think of the different forms of propulsion and different ways that one could access different, again, maybe, I don't want to say ether realms because there may be not just one or more, or there may just be one singular realm per se, but the layers of that realm. And I say this in a way that potentially prescribes to the narrative of how we look at individuals like Jacques Vallée, for example, saying that he believes there is some type of holographic machine that is changing our perception of when we observe UFOs and things like that. And not always to bring it back to UFOs, but or alien craft in general. But I find it interesting that the at least from my perspective, what comes to mind as you were speaking, Mark, was just the overall idea of there being some type of alteration within someone's esoteric body and their physical body as well. And if there's been some type of alteration of iron within said person's body, at the same time that they've been experiencing, what they claim to be witnessing a UFO, or even something even more so, an esoteric event where they're sleeping at night and they're abducted, or something like this occurs, or even for the sake of individuals practicing alchemy, if there's any contribution, not necessarily trying to say that in a good way or bad way, but a contribution towards the way in which someone's iron levels could actually, I guess you could say, alter the state of a certain electromagnetic spectrum. You know what I mean? So it wouldn't just be exclusive to a UFO experience. It would just be that if there were others that knew how to harness this, other humans, which I'm sure there have been and there are, what that would do to someone's, iron levels in their body, if there would be a magnetic, let alone an electromagnetic response that merges the ether realm with, for example, with the physical realm, if you want to call it. But that's what comes to mind for me at least.
Well, and we can even go back to like some kind of you know folklore that associates iron with fairies and things like that. And if we're going to look at things from a really like all-encompassing perspective, fairy encounters are very similar to what people would maybe call a ET or alien encounter today. So I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing to take it back to UFOs, because UFOs are inherently a part of this larger mystery that the elemental Philosophorum has been sort of assembled to dig into, and I think that, eventually we will find that if there's any truth to what I said before about the elite or the 1% manipulating reality with these sorts of alchemical processes, then the UFOs are definitely a part of it. Like, there's no doubt. I mean, just look at like the circles that are associated with UFOs in general. I mean, the military,
Right.
the weapons. I'm sorry, military industrial complex is the better term, because it's not just the United States military. It's all of these military groups. Anybody who takes up the business of killing people, I think, is a part of
Right.
a select group of industries that were started by these elites. I mean, you can look at like the Dutch East Indies Company. I mean, it's literally the reason why we have Wall Street, right? They invented
Right.
that system of sort of casino betting around like the values of commodities and such. So we're talking about a system that's been set up around us by these players, but enough time has passed to where the connection has become sort of murky and the propaganda has become very, very thick, and I think that's the other, reason why I really like talking about this stuff. I just listened to an episode of the Higher Side Chats that kind of talked about possibly ETs being some sort of version of entity that's actually from, I forget what they call them. It's like, it's confusing. Let me look it up right now. It'll take 2 seconds, but yeah, I found that fascinating, that the ETs that we think come from other planets or whatever are actually crypto terrestrial, meaning they're just, like in the same category as Sasquatch, so to speak, but way more nefarious and technologically advanced.
Right. And the other thing too that I find peculiar is that since we'll be delving into that area, it seems at least the ICC, for those who don't know, stands for the Interstellar or Intergalactic, whichever one you prefer, corporate conglomerates. So, Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, those guys. Allegedly, they have mining operations on certain comets, on certain moons, and they mine for iron. Now, the thing that I find most interesting about all of this in particular is why the mining for iron seems to be so prevalent and such to again, we're saying, assuming the pieces of evidence that have come out, if even if some of it is disinformation or misinformation, presuming the consistency of the fabrics of truth over the last 70 plus years are consistent and resonate some type of veracity, I wonder to what extent the mining of iron seems to play in terms of what the goals are for these big I guess you could say intergalactic corporate conglomerate apparatuses. Why iron is so significant to them? Why is it, again, could it be pertaining to the fact that there is a thin layer of magnetization that could be activated?
Right.
I'm curious because everything that I've ever seen pertaining to this has to do with mining iron. Always, always, always. And I find that very, very peculiar.
Mm. Well, it goes back to alchemy, man. I mean, it's the primary interest of the ruling elite because it yields so much power, especially in their day with the sort of, I mean, we would think of it from a modern perspective, which I don't particularly agree with, like kind of like silly that they associated like, spiritual alchemy, esoteric alchemy, and then metallurgy all in the same group. But you got to understand like that perspective, so to speak, in the context of where they are at in that point in time. And it's like, all of these things are still related today. We only think of them as separate because of science and scientism, the belief that science is somehow, inherently material based, right?
Right.
So I think,
Well,
alchemy really is the key factor to understanding this kind of process. And it is metaphorical. It's not just practical, even though we call practical alchemy chemistry now, it didn't
Mhm.
make,
yeah.
actual alchemy become any less powerful than it once was.
Right. And this is where, for example, I don't know if this quote is exclusive to Mr. Elizondo, but I've been brushing up on his work a lot lately, at least what he's presented externally. And he said something interesting lately that we can apply to what's going on in society today. But again, that's probably for another time. But he says the problem with the scientific community, at least in his humble opinion, is that people, and not just in the scientific community in general, people conflate and they confuse science with scientism, right? And like what you said it perfectly, Mark, what's now considered chemistry was, back in the day, this type of mysterious alchemy, if you will, right? And so we see that sort of evolution.
Well,
And
even to your
yeah.
your point about like why are so many people interested in it, it's like think about where corporations came from. Like I said, with the Dutch East Indies Company, like these were people who set out to sail, right, and discovered new lands, and we live in those lands.
Right.
So the rules that they followed when they created the laws of the ocean and whatnot, like that's what's created this new world that we're in. And a lot of these ventures that they would go on were in the interest of trading. And what's the most valuable thing to trade for? Gold, iron,
Yup.
silver, right? And especially in antiquity when those were like the most available of like what we would consider now like rare materials, what's on the periodic table of element, not all of them you can just go and find somewhere, now
Right.
most of
Yeah.
those you need a special technology to even understand what it is. But a group of those materials that we'll get into on the periodic table of elements like iron have had so much like mysticism around them because of how valuable they just inherently are. And they're valuable because of their scientific applications, but that doesn't separate them from the mystique. And my point is really just that like these companies that set out to like get gold, like Cortez, like all these
Yeah.
groups They're no different than the Fortune 500 companies and all the, it's just the same game expanded over 400 years, 500, 600, even going back to, Babylon.
Right. No, exactly. And even the hidden history and the deliberately hidden history of a lot of things that again, where we have now come to realize, whether it's alchemy, whether it's certain metallurgies, have played very, very significant roles in the I guess you could say, the evolution of humankind in a certain regard without it going public. And one example I could say of that is, again, not corroborated to the point where it's like, okay, this absolutely happened, but there are consistencies within textures and scripts written during Napoleon Bonaparte's time. There was a point in which he could not be found for a handful of days. He had claimed that he had been kidnapped by an enemy paramilitary or army group, if you will, and that was that. Now, with that being said, there's now some revelations coming about, more so on the dark web than that of the surface part of the internet, but you could find some there too, about a nanochip being found in Napoleon's skull. Interestingly enough, the nanochip, seemingly on the surface, seemed to be based on just preliminary analysis, was iron. It seemed to be at least some type of composite of iron. So I find that interesting to see that there's, again, the problem with this is that no official quote unquote institution is going to come forward and say, the Smithsonian, you name it, right? MoMA, whatever you want to say. Sorry, not MoMA. It was another institution. Anyways, they won't acknowledge these type of things. So it only leaves people like us to speculate and to be able to say, okay, where can we go from here based on what we're seeing and what we have seen.
Absolutely. Well said.
I mean, just a couple, finding more as I'm looking around. Iron even seems to have interesting reactions on the nuclear side. There was strange, almost as if, spontaneously appearing iron deposits popping up in the desert near Los Alamos while they're doing nuclear testing. There's so in nuclear fission, physics, whatever, going back to Mark's electric universe theory, there is maybe some kind of from nothing creating of iron being maybe one of the easiest things that can just be, one of the most common, obvious metals on the earth, but also common in space.
I just wanted to,
go ahead.
sorry, Ken, when you said it's one of the possible metals that could just be, simply like referring to the natural, curation of this universe, whatever it is, simulation, electric universe, maybe all of that, all of the above. But it's interesting you say that, because if there is any substantiability to Sir Roger Penrose's spinner theory pertaining to what we initially, what I brought up at the beginning of this episode, I find that interesting, because if Sir Roger Penrose's spinner theory has, even if he's not correct entirely, and I'm not trying to say he's wrong, because I could never do the work that he's done, but if there even is a little bit of validity to that, to the spinner theory and spinners and that pertaining to physics and all of that type of, that whole aspect there, I wonder if there is a similar consistency within that of iron that's just not out there publicly on the surface. Maybe people have not even thought to look there, because
Right.
so many other things. Maybe they haven't gone grants for it, or maybe they purposely haven't gone grants for it because there is something there.
No, exactly. I mean, I've just about honestly exhausted my own research into this. I mean, we go where we've just like the one we did the other week, we kind of find things as we go. But as far as actual particular findings, it seems like there is a natural order to the universe, like you were just saying, and it seems like iron really fits that natural order
Right.
really well.
Yeah.
It does. It seems like it anyways, right? We haven't had anyone go look in that direction maybe, but that definitely seems to be, at least, in our batshit crazy people minds, where things are pointing.
Right. And it's interesting because when you said you've exhausted your resources pertaining to iron, I have to admit myself, I mean, the conversations that we go down when us three get together are phenomenal. But iron I found to be very difficult to compare to, say, for example, the first element we looked at or the previous element. And I find that more intriguing than
Because
frustrating
it's
because
so
it's all
basic, right? It's so
right,
abundant. It's
right.
so like, why isn't there more research, more crazy things found out about it yet? Yeah.
Right, right. And that's, yeah, that's what takes me to that whole idea of, again, sort of thinking of, if you were an investigator and you were to draw on a metaphorical drawing board, or a chalkboard, what you know about iron and then what you don't know about iron. I am certain, at least in my opinion, there's going to be a lot more that what you don't know than what you know. And
Right.
the question then becomes, which angle do we have to approach to find that data? And if there's no data out there pertaining to that, why hasn't there been any data put out there? Has there been a deliberate suppression of it? It's not to say, again, I'm not trying to make something out of nothing. Sometimes people will just say, dude, there's nothing there because there's nothing there. But again, I don't, in life in general, I don't feel like that's ever the case, you know? So that I apply that same mentality
Absolutely.
to this, to researching this topic and all that. Mark, brother, you want to jump in? Or
I agree with what you're saying. Yeah, I think that's really, no stone left unturned at the expense of the stones, like I think, yeah, you just gotta really look for what you're looking for, depending on what you're looking for. I don't know. It depends.
right,
When it comes to iron, though, I think the cases, it's already so applicable. It's almost like it's being used. Maybe the case is just like not to be, bleeding into what you just kind of set against, but maybe they're just using it so much to make steel that they never thought to go ahead and look at some of the more mysterious
Maybe
sides of
so. Right. Yeah. Maybe so.
it. I mean, it's so useful. It's been useful. But like I said, it's got these associations with war. It's got these associations with male fertility. It's
mm,
got associations with the military industrial complex. I mean, steel is how they make weapons. It's just very useful for that.
I found something very quickly that here pertaining to the northern and southern lights. Very recently, people have said that they've been able to hear the northern lights in terms of a sound, if you want to call it. And the sound, based on the general direction, the consistent pattern of where people say the sounds are coming from, based on, where they point, okay, this part in the sky and what have you. Interestingly enough, again, there may be something here, there may not be, but I think it's important to throw it out there. Connect to the alleged, and I say this carefully, the alleged planets where these ICC conglomerates are doing their mining for iron. And I've been told as well too, off the record, but not to say this is true per se, but when certain parts, certain, I don't want to say forms, but I guess if you want to call, I don't even want to use the word variation, but when iron generally is brought into a very highly charged electromagnetic vicinity. And when I say highly charged, I'm referring to esoteric spirits and, alleged haunted locations. There seems to be much more activity when iron is brought into that location compared to when it is taken out. If I'm not mistaken, I do not mean to put words in anyone's mouth here, but there were some paranormal investigators, take them as you will, that have attempted this, and they've found some interesting things that have come from this, in addition to, corresponding it with certain electromagnetic devices and equipment.
Mm. Yeah, I was just walking through like a little you can call it like a nature preserve, I guess, but in Connecticut we got like hundreds of these. In every town there's little spots designated as parks, and they just woods. So I was walking through the woods looking along the river, and I find this piece of iron just like all corroded, and I'm like, oh wow, this is interesting, because this was a couple days before we were supposed to do this, what, like a week ago. And
Right.
I was like, oh wow, that's weird, we're going to talk about iron. I find this weird piece of iron, and just the way it was shaped, it just, it was kind of like almost like a nail, but then towards the end where you think like the head of the nail would be,
Yeah.
there was like this weird, like almost square shaped part of it. So I'm like, this could be a part of like some kind of old, you know, railroad tie or some kind of weird thing like that. But just the way it corroded. And after this conversation, my hopes is that it's some kind of meteoric iron that I just happened to find.
I'm
Cool.
thinking that the meteoric iron is more abundant than anyone had originally thought. Maybe there seems to be I mean, you point to Tutankhamun having a meteor sword, Damascus steel coming from meteors originally, that Hoba thing. I mean, there seems to be a lot of meteoric iron even besides the naturally occurring.
Mm.
Well, one thing I wanted to add as well too is that it just came to my mind now, and thank you for that story, brother, because that really, if not for that, I maybe would have not thought of this. But when you see, for example, Project Carrot, or whether it's Bob Lazar, Lou Elizondo, or many alleged whistleblowers and things like that, but more so the ones that have chosen to be a little more, I guess you could say, under the radar because of the details they've brought out. One interesting thing that I found is that in the research, and our audience will know generally that the the composition of certain okay, so this is going to be a little bit of an explanation, but just bear with me. The composition of certain or of all alien craft, really, whatever metallurgy they're made of, when you were to split those pieces of the craft up into different chunks, regardless of whether big or small, regardless if you cut it into a triangular chunk or anything like this, it doesn't matter how. If you were to analyze the subatomic structure and the details of it, it still represents the entirety of the rest of the craft. And basically saying that it is in and of itself a living entity or a living representation of the rest of the craft. You see what I'm saying? No matter how much you cut it up, the more you the more you looked into, big or small the piece, the more you saw, oh my gosh, this is this is like the makeup of the rest of the craft. Now, I connect this to iron because, interestingly enough, I wonder if, Mark, that story you said about going for your walk and noticing this metallurgy of iron there. I wonder if, and going back to what you said, Camden, about how this might just be the way in which the universe comprises iron of, if iron is a sort of representation of that sort of example. Not saying that there's a connection, but that that same ideology or a perspective could be applied to other areas. So, for example, iron frequentially, materialistically, the subatomic structure of it, which could be why there's no public research out there pertaining to much of this, is actually consistent with that of what's found in our bodies, with that of what's found all over the place, that would then subscribe and add or further the electric universe theory. The question becomes, where's the mergent point between the esoteric side and the physical side of the iron itself?
Exactly. Where, I mean, that's maybe someone will start a science experiment from this even conversation, but where is that? Let's go. Someone needs to go find it.
Right. Exactly. I see what's it called, Mark? You pulled up a book there?
Yeah, I did. I saw that. Yeah.
Yeah, maybe it's a bad habit. Hold on.
No, I think that's a good habit.
I thought this book might be part of what we were talking about, but it might just be a bad habit because I don't think I am equipped to find the exact part of the book. But yeah, man, I just think, like, going back to what we were talking about with graphite being a possible candidate for another episode, if that's on the table of elements, is it? I'm not sure.
It's a yes and no. I know which one I'm thinking of. We'll
We'll get into that in another episode, but I definitely think there's an interdimensional aspect to what's going on with UFOs and with human consciousness and with everything to do with our bloodstreams and iron, and like the psychic nature of the moon, the magnetic nature of the moon. You talked about just now iron being, in the northern hemisphere of the moon, right?
Yeah.
But, people might be like, banging on the the roof of their car right now, listen to this, like, the moon doesn't, we've never been to the moon. Like, I don't know how, that fits into it, but you can't deny that the moon has that effect on the earth, right? That's
Right.
magnetism.
Point
So,
blank, tides alone.
whether or not
yeah.
we've been there or not, I just wanted to clear that up for those folks who are listening, because this, I'm not completely sold on space travel, even though I do enjoy speaking to you guys about all this stuff. Like, I'm just wondering, like, how it fits into this kind of realm that we're living in, like, it's more, and Sam says this a lot now, it's like we're really living in some sort of realm, and I think what that really means is that there are interdimensional aspects to our ordinary lives that we're pretty much ignorant to, and things like iron give us little clues into what could be really going on, because like microcosm, macrocosm, the things that are happening on a micro level in our bodies have truths to reveal about the larger effects that we deal with in daily life and in extreme circumstances, like being abducted by a UFO, like Dave said before, maybe even like, astral projection. Because it seems to me like the majority of people, and I'm not excluding myself, are living less than healthy lives just due to the modern circumstances, the
Right.
modern food, the modern diet, right? So we're already ill-equipped to become, let's say, astral travelers, right? Well, what if things like iron, these components in our bodies that we're lacking in a lot of cases, people are deficient of iron, like you said at the beginning of this episode, like what if those components are contributing to our kind of ignorance towards that interdimensional nature of our reality, and that's like a move that's being played against us so that we have less of a capacity to compete with whatever UFOs are, and whatever their agenda is.
Right. And it wanted to say very quickly, when you brought up macro and micro cosms, I can't help but think of the Hermetic principles, as above, so below, not necessarily saying small and big, but that same concept of, again, there being a magnetic opposite, sort of a binary concept of sorts, if you want to refer to it as that. But yeah, no, absolutely. Absolutely. I'm not sure, brother, how much more time you wanted to go on for. This was I guess you could say, positively and unfortunately, this was the extent of the research that I had found.
Yeah.
But is there anything else you wanted to throw in or add before we wrap it up, or?
I think what we covered today is a good kind of even spread of some of the things that I found, and I'm sure you guys found, like you said, that's all there really is to iron. Obviously, meteoric iron is very interesting.
That's all that's publicly there to iron.
Right. But that's with that being said, I think the elemental philosophorum that we've created here, we don't have any rules saying we can't revisit iron in the future if something
Right.
else comes up, or if the listeners have been like listening, like I said, maybe they're punching their steering wheel saying like, why aren't you talking about this? Like, so if you think we missed anything, send it our way. You can reach me on Instagram. My family thinks I'm crazy on Instagram, and even my website has my email address there, so my family thinks I'm crazy.com, and reach me there.
Perfect, brother. Thank you so much for coming on again. Everyone in the audience loves this series, and we will be covering another element in the next week or two. Thank you so much, everyone.